I want to welcome you all to the Responsible Conduct of Research Workshop Series, Workshop 6. This is the IRB and Ethical Use of Human Subjects in Research by Dr. Richard Karalus, who is Director of the Office of Research Compliance, and he knows everything IRB related. I also want to tell you that if you attended all 6 workshops, you can receive a certificate of completion, which will be coming in a couple weeks. If you are interested in the certificate and didn't attend all the workshops, you can email me at cmp9@buffalo.edu, and I will put that in the chat shortly, probably more towards the end of this presentation. There's a short protocol you can do in order to watch the video and do a short write-up in order to be marked as attended. Also, if you're interested in the Responsible Conduct of Research micro-credential, which can use the videos to build background and activate prior knowledge if you do need to do so, then please also email me at cmp9@buffalo.edu. And we are super flexible with when you have to turn in assignments. You basically make your own timeline for that. So I'm also going to put up right at the end of this presentation something in chat that has to do with the survey, and that's an evaluation, and it helps us to continue to improve these workshops, and it also is important to our funding source. And now I'm going to turn it over to our expert. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is, as Catherine said, Rich Karalus. I'm the Director of the Office of Research Compliance. And contrary to what Catherine says, I do not know everything on human subjects research. I am always learning myself. So, first of all, I'll just, next slide. Just have to disclose that I have no financial or other conflicts of interest in doing this presentation. So, just need to do that official. Next slide. So, just to show that scientists still seem to go beyond the bounds of what's considered ethical. This was actually a study that was done about 8 years ago, and it was done in China. And I don't mean to pick on China. The reason why it was done in China was because back in 2018, they still hadn't had a chance to revise their laws on doing genetic alterations in human beings. A lot of countries did. The European Union had already done it. The United States already had regulations in place. But there was a scientist who decided to go and do this research and genetically alter embryos and have babies born from that work, and did it in China because he knew he couldn't do it anyplace else and that China didn't yet have their laws in place. So one of the things that really caught my interest when I read this was he altered the embryos for 7 couples, but only 1 successful pregnancy resulted. So, being in the ethics office, I would ask what happened to those other 7 embryos. Did they result in pregnancies? Were they stillborn? Did they not result in pregnancies? Things like that, are risks that, we would take into consideration. And there are a number of risks. So, next slide. So there were a lot of issues with this study. Right, next slide. All right, so first of all, these are previous slide, sorry. Computers seem to be slow today. Previous slide. So for the study, there was actually no safety or peer review. There was no IRB review, no ethics review. There were no reviews at all done on this. The scientists just decided to go ahead with it, and it had a lot of issues with it. Next slide. So there are basically no real benefits to any of the children or the parents that were born. So what the scientist did was basically he engineered an HIV-resistant gene into embryos so that the children born would be more resistant to HIV. Now, there might have been some benefits to the subjects if, let's say, the mother or the father had HIV, where there was a risk that the baby might be HIV positive upon birth. But again, the parents did not have HIV, so there was not that risk there. They also used what we would consider subjects that should get additional protections. Pregnant women and fetuses are considered special subjects that deserve extra protection. So we, here in the United States, we give those additional safeguards because obviously fetuses can't consent and can't provide their own protection. They can't. Improper consent, again, all the parents were told was that they would be in a study that was involved with AIDS vaccine development. That was pretty much the length of the consent form. In addition, the investigator had financial conflicts. He was involved with a couple of companies that wished to commercialize genetically altering babies, and he did not disclose that to the subject. So there were a lot of issues with this study, and this study would have never been approved anywhere where there was an ethics review. So, like I said, this was just 8 short years ago, and we continue to see cases like this pop up. So we need to be very vigilant and use proper ethics and proper review. So next slide. I'll give another example. So this is probably the biggest study that I would consider the most unethical, one that has caused the most issues. And this is the vaccine autism link. This was a study that was published back in 1998 by Andrew Wakefield. And he published a link between autism and vaccination. The study that he published was a really small study. It only included 12 subjects. So if you're looking for an autism vaccination link, even if you're looking in the regular population, autism is not an overly common condition. You're not going to see it in 1 in 12 subjects. So using 12 subjects is not at all going to give you any valuable results. His data didn't support the conclusion. Basically, what he did on this study was he chose 12 infants that were recently diagnosed with autism. And what he said was that they got autism because they were vaccinated close to the time where they were shown to have autism, where they were diagnosed with autism. That was his connection between vaccination and autism. Now, we all know infants are always getting vaccines, and we also know that that autism is diagnosed at infancy. That was the only connection he had. So he handpicked 12 autistic children and said they got autism because they also received vaccines at the time. Obviously, any scientist would not publish that, and that conclusion definitely does not, the data definitely does not support that conclusion. Furthermore, he took money from a law firm. The law firm paid him to do this study because they wanted to sue one of the large vaccine makers and basically make a huge settlement. And he never disclosed that when he published this work also. So since then, over 20 scientific studies have been done with millions and millions of children that do not support the conclusion. So next slide. So what does this do for us? What are the results of it today? It's so difficult to overcome this perception. We're all faced today with conspiracy theories left and right. Everything seems to be a conspiracy. So people just don't want to consider the facts. They distrust authorities these days, and no matter how much good data you present, they just consider it a conspiracy theory that the drug companies are trying to cover up this link. Some people actually stated that, well, it may not be the actual vaccine that causes the autism link. It might be the preservative that they used in the vaccine. A lot of vaccines in the past used to use thimerosal, which is a mercury-based preservative. And they thought, well, maybe the mercury is what's causing the autism, because we all know mercury is bad for humans. However, the vaccine that they were studying was actually a live attenuated vaccine and didn't have any preservatives in it. So people still feel that it might be preservative based when the vaccine that Andrew Wakefield published, they had no preservatives in it. So next slide. So what does this do? What are the results of it? It fuels a whole lot of resistance to vaccination. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing that where approximately 10%, and since I put together the slide, the number of parents who are refusing vaccines is increasing all the time. People also don't understand the risk of not getting vaccinated. So before the time of childhood vaccinations, the life expectancy of a human was on the order of the early 40s, 43. And it wasn't because adults didn't live in later ages, 60, 70, even 80 years old. The reason was because approximately half of children would never live to past infancy. They would die of childhood illnesses that we routinely vaccinate for now. What does this also do? So, children don't have the intelligence yet to decide whether they want the vaccination or not. So they can't decide for themselves. They're relying on their parents to make the best decisions for them. And if they're making it on flawed data, then obviously the kids may be the ones who are paying the price. It also places other people at risk. So, we all know about herd immunity, and we have to have a certain level of vaccination in our society in order to prevent epidemics. For example, we're seeing a lot of measles epidemics right now. Measles is probably one of the most infectious diseases that there is. And we basically had it eradicated here in the Western Hemisphere up until about 2017, when all of a sudden we started seeing a lot of people refusing vaccines and started to see epidemics popping up here in the United States every year. And we're undergoing an epidemic down in the South right now for measles. So what does this do for children? So some children react to vaccines, and there are others who are immunocompromised or for genetic reasons don't respond to the vaccine. So if they're exposed to these individuals who get measles who choose not to be vaccinated, then they may contract the disease even though they chose to be vaccinated. So it places others at risk, not only the children and the parents who are not receiving the vaccination. So it's not just the individuals who are making the choice, it's others who can't make the choice. So, just want to point that as some unethical research that's being done. So let's switch gears. We'll go to the next one. So what is the definition of ethics? The definition of ethics is the discipline of dealing with what is good, bad, and with moral duty and obligation. Seems pretty easy. I'm sure most of us consider ourselves very ethical people. We know what's right from wrong. And I actually hope to raise more questions on ethics than I'm going to answer, because ethics is not quite as clean as that definition is. So next slide. So what is ethics? It's a consideration basically of what is good, what's bad, and also what's acceptable. And we all kind of think it's intrinsic. I'm sure everybody in this class would consider it unethical to kill another person. But we might want to look at it in some other ways. What about in times of war? What happens if you're drafted into the military and put in a war situation? Or what happens if you're defending your home from somebody who's invading it and threatening your family? Then is it all of a sudden unethical to kill that person, or does it now become ethical? I don't know the answers to that. I guess everybody needs to decide that for themselves, and society also needs to decide that. Obviously we all consider warfare bad, but if you're in the middle of a war, is it now acceptable to kill? And like I said, I just raised questions like that to show that ethics might not be as intrinsic as we think. Ethics is also based on a lot of experiences. It's based on our personal experiences throughout our life. We kind of define what is good and bad by what happens to us in our lifetime. It's also society-based. We look at our society today, and I look at it, and ethics seems to have slipped a whole lot, in my opinion anyway, over the last 10 years compared to when I was younger. A lot of things that were considered totally unacceptable when I was younger are now considered acceptable and even promoted in society today. Our peers also are big drivers of what we consider acceptable and unacceptable. We want to show to our peers, our friends and people that we work with, that we're ethical people. So we need to kind of be as ethical as what they consider ethical. So leaders, I'm not even going to go into the leadership these days, because our leaders seem to be setting examples that, might not be the best examples to be set. Time periods, different time periods. What's acceptable in one time period may not be acceptable in another time period. 100 things that happened 100 years ago that were considered totally acceptable today may not be considered acceptable. And I kind of talked a little bit about how I think ethics seems to be slipping in the last 10 years. So time periods definitely drive what's considered ethical. Technology also is a big driver of what's considered ethical and what's not considered ethical. I talked about the genetic engineering of embryos. 15 years ago, we wouldn't have even thought of trying to genetically engineer a person and do it. Yet today, we're almost to the point of being able to do that. So that kind of raises ethical questions on itself. So next slide. So why is ethics important? Ethics is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it satisfies the need for fairness and honesty. For all of us to function in society, we need to kind of all adhere to the same rules and considerations of what is wrong. It develops trust between people, provides credibility of ourselves when we're dealing with our peers and other people in society. It gives us a good reputation or a bad reputation. Improves our decision making when we're faced with different situations. It helps accomplish our long-term goals and it unites society so that we can function together as a team rather than just competing with each other. So next slide. So we'll switch gears and go to research, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about ethics in research. So let's talk a little bit about consideration of research topics. When we select a topic to study, we need to make sure that it's an acceptable topic. Back in the times of World War II, there was a big studies in Germany about eugenics. The study of different races and which ones were superior. And today, again, that would not be considered a very acceptable subject to study. Need to make sure that whatever research topics have are beneficial to society or at least not harmful. And by not harmful, I mean sometimes we study things just for the sake of studying things, but whatever we study, we need to make sure that we're not placing people at risk for no reason. When we also consider a research topic, we need to consider the research methods. Do we have ethical research methods that we're going to use? Let's say we wanted to discover the cure for cancer. However, in order to discover the cure for cancer, we might have to sacrifice a million or several million human beings to do the testing in order to get the cure. Well, it might not be time to do that research if we have to sacrifice persons in that huge number. So we need to make sure that the methods that we're using, the benefits of the methods outweigh the risks. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. One of the big things I want to talk about in ethics is data integrity. Data integrity is so important these days. So as scientists, we're always pressured to publish and to publish positive outcomes and prove our hypotheses to be correct. And anybody who's worked in the lab, I'm a former researcher myself, knows that you can go for months without anything going right. And then all of a sudden you'll go for a month where nothing will go wrong, everything will go perfect, and you'll get great results. However, when you're looking, there's always pressure to publish, and there's always pressure to kind of maybe fudge your results a little bit, or you know what, I'm just going to select the experiments that worked and ignore all of those that didn't work, and that proves my hypothesis. So let's say we do 10 experiments and only 2 of them work. So we decide we're going to do 100 experiments, and then we've got 20 positive results, but we're going to ignore those 80 results that didn't work. That's not really ethical, and that's not the way to do research. We need to make sure that the bulk of our results support our hypothesis. Everybody always wants to publish their best experiments, so there's nothing wrong with that. We always want to put our best pictures and our best results in our publication. But the overall data of what you're testing has to support that work that you're publishing. You can't just publish the outliers and consider that as the data that supports your hypothesis, because that's going to cause both other scientists and yourself a lot of problems in the future. Because even though we always consider science to always be a hypothesis and never fact, everybody kind of is going to consider if you publish your results to be fact. and they're going to base their future studies on it. And if they're basing their future studies on falsified data or data that just doesn't support the hypothesis, then it's going to slow down science. It's going to waste resources, and it's going to cost you your reputation. And I've seen that happen in the past, where people's reputations have cost them because they've published just a few studies, similar to the Andrew Wakefield study, where the data just doesn't support the conclusion. Like I said, we're always under pressure to publish and to get grants and such, but don't ever fall into the trap of publishing false data or data that just doesn't support the conclusion, because it will cost you. And in some cases, it will cost you your career. I've seen that a couple of times here at the university, where people have published false data and their career ended right there. One of the cases actually happened in the lab that I was in as a postdoc. So don't do it. Don't go down that road. All right. Another ethical thing is to share or not to share. Sometimes we don't want to share our data. If we, until we publish it, maybe we are forming a company, maybe we're getting patents. But what about the case, say if you do cure cancer and it's going to take you a year or two to publish it and put together your patents and get them approved and put together your company? Do you hold that cure from society when you could save hundreds of thousands or millions of people from dying of cancer? That's kind of a choice that you have to make, and it's not an easy choice to make. So next slide. So now I want to talk about another reason why we need to be ethical in research. So OHRP is the Office of Human Research Protections, and about 20 years ago, they really started cracking down on human subjects research, because society was kind of taking it lightly. If you've ever watched an old movie, you look at the old scientists, they talk in Latin terms, and to sort of regular people in society who don't understand it. And those regular people just kind of take it for granted that those wise scientists have their best interests in mind. And that is not always the case. Sometimes we as scientists get kind of tunnel vision. We think we're on the right track, but when you step back and take a look at it, you may be going down this tunnel that you just didn't see the risks. So I'll bring a couple of examples and talk about them. So next slide. So Duke University in 1999, Duke was subject to just basically a random site visit, and OHRP came and they found a lot of issues with the Human Subjects Protections Office. And that's not uncommon. They do find deficiencies whenever you get audited. If anybody's ever been audited, auditors always come in and find deficiencies. They found a lot of serious deficiencies and basically issued a report back to Duke and expected Duke to, quickly remedy them. Came back 6 months and found that there was basically a really poor, unsatisfactory response, that Duke seemed to be really dragging their feet, not taking the audit seriously. And OHRP realized that this is kind of something that's taking place at almost all universities around the country. They have human subjects protection programs, but they're really not following that well, and they're lax and letting a lot of subjects be approved that probably shouldn't be. So they actually shut Duke University and all of their research down, all their federally funded research down, and basically said it's a failure of their leadership. They are not taking it seriously. So they decided to go and look at some more big universities. Next slide. They went to Johns Hopkins 2 years later, probably one of the biggest research universities in the country. And we're looking at a case where a young lady, 24-year-old Ellen Roche, decided to take part in an asthma study. And she was given a drug called hexamethonium to induce a mild asthma attack as part of the study. However, within 24 hours, she lost a significant amount of her lung capacity and was put in the hospital. And within a month, she had died. So they audited the study and looked at what was done, and knew that this drug hexamethonium had some problems. So they looked at the PI and looked at his submission to the IRB at the time. And basically what he did was he only looked at a very limited number of publications And there weren't a lot of publications on hexamethonium because it was used way back in the 50s and found to have a lot of issues with it. So there weren't a lot of publications because the side effects were published so long ago. And at the time in 2001, when you went into PubMed only went back to about the publications from the 90s forward. So all of those old publications that warned on the side effects of hexamethonium were never viewed. And the PI never went back that far to look into any of the side effects of hexamethonium. He just put it in his study, just assuming that all it does is causes a mild asthma attack. The IRB at Johns Hopkins also didn't go back and look at the risk that were associated with hexamethonium. So the whole committee, when they reviewed the study, never went and looked and did a close look at the risk of the study. So again, OHARP suspended human subjects studies at Johns Hopkins, 2,400 ongoing studies, 15,000 human subjects, and decided that they were not having any more of it. And this was a shot across the bow for every university in the country. Holy cow, OHARP just came and shut down Duke and Johns Hopkins within 2 years, and they were starting to audit other universities. This basically kind of lit a fire under everybody, including at the university, to basically get their programs in order. And, which, is kind of the result today where we, do a significant review and, consider all, risks. So again, this was considered just laziness on the part of the IRB. We're going through the, just going through the numbers and allowing research to be, approved based on the PI, thinking they were doing it properly, which just wasn't the case. All right, so we'll go with the next slide. So I'm going to go on with the history of compliance. We'll go on the next slide. So human subjects compliance really started in earnest about World War II. So the Germans and the Japanese did a lot of different experiments that were just gruesome experiments during World War II. I have a list over here of all the different experiments that they were doing. They were, and if you look at this list, it's actually not quite as bad as you would think. This was the World War II. And again, most of these experiments that they were doing were based on saving their soldiers from injuries. Freezing experiments were because they were losing pilots in the North Atlantic, and they needed to figure out ways to save them from freezing. Malaria obviously was endemic in the areas where they were fighting, and things like that. They injected seawater into people. It sounds horrible. Why would you inject seawater into people? The reason why they wanted to inject seawater into people was because in order to treat their wounded, you needed to have saline. Saline was a huge burden to carry. It took up a lot of volume in their logistics, and they decided, well, maybe we can just use diluted seawater because, saline is basically a dilute saltwater solution. So they decided maybe we can just, filter and dilute seawater and inject it in people. Well, obviously these experiments didn't work very well, and they did them on POWs. They did them on people that they would just kidnap from the street, and they never told these people what they were doing to them, never consented them, never allowed them to make the choice of being in the study or quit the study. And after World War II, there were the Nuremberg trials. We'll go to the next slide. And we basically came up in 1947, which is known as the Nuremberg Code, on how to do human subjects research. And the Nuremberg Code is actually quite good. So first, we'll go through the steps. Voluntary consent is essential. That's great. You want to give people the choice of being in research or not. We do that today. Second one is research must have scientific merit for the good of society. Again, risk versus benefit. And I talked about that a little bit earlier. That's a great point too. Experiments should be based on the results of animal experiments and knowledge of disease. That's something that we go through today. We want to make sure that you do all the animal experiments that you can to show the efficacy and the safety of whatever you happen to be testing before you ever enroll a single human subject. Experiments should also avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Common sense. We want to make sure that our studies obviously avoid those to the highest extent that we possibly can. No experiment should be conducted if there is reason to believe that death or disabling injury may occur. Now, we allow a little bit of risk, but at the time of World War II, they knew that a lot of subjects were going to die and accepted that. We allow a slight risk because we know there's always risk involved with doing studies. But if there's a huge risk, obviously, we're not going to approve a study. So, that's a good point, too. The degree of risk should never exceed the importance of the problem to be solved. Again, I kind of talked about the cancer cure. If you got to kill 1 million people in order to get the cure for cancer, well, maybe the risk exceeds the importance of what you're solving at the time. Next slide. Proper preparations and adequate facilities should be available to protect subjects from injury, disability, and death. So a lot of those studies in Germany and Japan were done in POW camps and not done in hospitals or health clinics or anything like that. They were just done without any regard for safety. So good point. Experiments should only be conducted by scientifically qualified persons. If you're studying a drug, you need to be a qualified medical doctor. We don't want just, PhDs who know the drug but don't know how to work with humans conducting scientific studies with persons. The human subject also has the right to discontinue participation at any time during the experiment. This is important. If you enroll in a study and you decide to quit, that should be your right to stop right there if you need to be. There may be certain studies where there might have a protocol to get you out of the study. You might have to wean somebody off of a drug, or you might have to work with, let's say, an implanted device or something like that. But for the most part, they can discontinue at any time during an experiment. Also, the scientist has the obligation to discontinue the experiment if it is likely to result in injury, disability, or death. So if you're carrying on the experiments and you realize halfway through the study or any time during the study that the risks are outweighing the benefits, the scientist has the obligation to stop the study right there. So sounds really good. Those are good points, and we should use those. And a lot of those we do use. So let's go on, and I'll talk about a little bit of research that took place in the United States. So there were, after, we would think having the Nuremberg Code, we're all set here in the States. So I'll just go through a few studies that, were considered unethical. Johns Hopkins University used prostitutes to infect prisoners, insane asylum patients, and soldiers with syphilis to test penicillin in Guatemala. And obviously, we're not going to allow that to happen. When asked why in Guatemala, he responded he wouldn't be allowed to do it in the U.S. Similar to the experiments that were done in China, we had rules against doing that, but in Guatemala, they were free to do that. 1946 through 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission was feeding mentally disabled children Quaker oats that contained radioisotopes because they wanted to study radioisotopes, the exposure of humans to radioisotopes, because it was the time of the Cold War and atomic warfare seemed like it was always on the cusp. Children were just told they were joining the science club. They were institutionalized, so they didn't have to get permission from the adults. It was an easy group to grab, and they were allowed to do these studies. 1953, U.S. Army soldiers were exposed to sulfur mustard and nerve agents. The soldiers were not asked to volunteer. They were not informed that they were going to be part of the test. They were simply put in chambers and exposed to the different gases and studied how they reacted to them. The reason why they could do it was because soldiers were considered government property, not individuals. 63 through 66, New York University, Saul Krugman infected mentally disabled children with viral hepatitis at the Willowbrook State School. He told the parents that he was giving vaccinations. 1963 through 73, Carl Heller and Joseph Hamilton irradiated the testes of prisoners to determine the effects of radiation on testicular function. Again, those Cold War studies. Basically stated the experiments had a little bit of the Buchenwald touch, kind of a scary little thought that he knew he was kind of doing wrong, but went ahead with the studies anyway. 1965 through 66, Albert Klugman performed dermatological studies on prisoners with dioxin. When he looked at the prisoners, he was quoted as saying, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Again, no concern for the subjects as humans. He just saw a lot of skin that he could do tests on with dioxin, which is super harmful. Okay, next slide. This is kind of the study that kind of broke the back and realized we in the United States have a problem here with human subjects study. We're not following these Nuremberg principles. And the reason why is because, again, we had what I call scientific tunnel vision. We were from the United States. We didn't do any of those. We were superior to the Germans and the Japanese at the time of World War II. We didn't, we were a democracy and we just do what's proper and right. And based on what I showed you, obviously that was not taking place. So this was kind of a study that broke it all open. The U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee Syphilis Study. This was a study that took place for 40 years, 1932 to 1972. And it started off with good goals. The goal was to record the natural history of syphilis and to justify better treatments programs for blacks and people with syphilis. The original study was supposed to take place for only 6 months. And back in 1932, there was no treatment for syphilis. We hadn't yet discovered antibiotics and hadn't yet had a cure for syphilis. So again, they were trying to figure out better treatments for syphilis. So there were a lot of issues with this study. They went and recruited subjects from rural African American society. These were people who, couldn't read, couldn't write. And basically the only informed consent they were told was that they were being treated for bad blood. The subjects never received treatment or even the choice of being treated when antibiotics became available to cure syphilis back in 1947. This subject, again, like I said, went on for 40 years until 1972 when the Associated Press published the story in the news, and all of a sudden there was a public outcry. How could you be, ignoring these people and basically studying them until they died when we already have a treatment for syphilis? So, next slide. So this resulted in them putting together a committee, the Belmont Committee, to come up with new rules and regulations that would govern the human subjects research here in the United States. And it was basically focused on 3 pillars. They came up with the Belmont Report in 1979. They took their time to try and do it right and came up with basically 3 pillars. The first was respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons means giving them proper information, having them comprehend the information, voluntariness of being in the study, and also privacy. Beneficence was basically the systemic assessment of risks and benefits. When IRBs look at the studies, they needed to take into consideration risks and benefits, and furthermore need to minimize the risk to the highest degree possible. And justice was basically the selection of subjects, making sure that we're not taking advantage of subjects. And I'll go into each of these pillars in a little bit more detail. So the next slide. So respect for persons, the first pillar. So information, we talked about information, full disclosure. If you've ever done an IRB study, we have huge consent forms. The consent forms are on the order of 20 pages and have all of the information on your study. They should have a description of the goals of the study, description of all of the procedures that take place in the study, a description of any alternative treatments. If you're in there being studied for a particular disease, you need to basically state that there may be alternative treatments beyond what you're studying and provide those alternatives to any potential subjects. You need to point out if you have any conflicts of interest. If you're getting paid by a drug company or you're forming a company yourself, or have a financial interest in what you're studying, you need to point that out to the subjects so they know that they won't be subject to coercion just because you have a financial interest to it. And any cost to the subjects seems kind of obvious, but in some cases, if you're injured in a study, will your health insurance cover those injuries? You don't have insurance. Will you have to cover your own cost, or will the company cover your cost? If there's cost for parking, you're going to a study downtown at the hospital, and you may need to pay $15 or $20 to park at the garage cost in the hospital. Any cost to the subjects, including the time that the subjects will spend in the study. Those are all considered costs, and all need to be disclosed to the subjects before they ever enroll in your study. Also, comprehension. I kind of talked about if, with the old movies, when you see the physicians talking in Latin and sounding really intelligent. Well, that's not allowed anymore. When you write a consent form, it has to be in layman's terms, and we consider that about a seventh grade level, so that everybody can understand what you've written in your consent form. And with consent forms, it has to be a two-way discussion. You can't just hand somebody a consent form, here, go, take this home, read it, sign it, and come back and you're in the study. No, you have to have a two-way discussion. You have to make sure that the potential subject understands all the information that you provided to them, that they don't have any questions on it. If they do have questions, need to answer that. And by the end of the consent process, we call it a consent process, not a consent form, because again, it is a two-way discussion, that the subjects fully understand what they're getting into and then can consent based on full understanding. Voluntariness, again, talked about this part of one of the Nuremberg principles, no penalties if one opts out. Many times we'll do studies with people, if you're a physician, people in your practice. If you're a faculty, you might do a study with people in your classroom. Need to make sure that they don't feel coerced for that reason. So, if you show up at your doctor's office, always want to please your doctor, come in at a good weight and this, that, and the other thing. And when they ask you to do something, you really want to kind of satisfy them. So if they mention that, they have a study ongoing, you might feel a little bit of coercion to be in that study, even if you don't want to, because you might feel that, well, if I turn my doctor down, I may not get the same level of care that I would if I enroll in the study, or if you're in a classroom, you may not want to turn your instructor down because you'll fear that maybe it may cost you in grades or such. So, need to make sure that those are taken into consideration, and there are ways of doing that. And also recruitment. You need to make sure that subjects are participating for the good of the study. So you can't offer, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to coerce people to be in a study because you can't because there are significant risks, and those risks are so high that you won't be able to find subjects unless you pay them a whole ton of money. That's all considered coercion, and it's against voluntariness. Privacy. We consider privacy important. Privacy is not the same as confidentiality. So confidentiality has to do with records, things that are written down or can be stored. Privacy has to do with conversations. So let's say, you're working in an infectious disease clinic and you're running an HIV study. You don't want to go out into the waiting room and say, "Hey, Mr. Smith, I have an HIV study going on. I know you're HIV positive. Will you be in my study?" In front of a crowd of 100 people who are also in that clinic. Those are considered privacy issues. Need to make sure that any discussions that take place in private and are not allowing your information to be heard amongst the public. All right, next pillar, beneficence. So beneficence is important. Systematic assessment of risks and benefits. In any study, we, the IRB, are going to look at that study and make sure that the benefits outweigh any risks. Sometimes there may be no benefits, but in the case of studies where there may be no benefits, you're doing a survey or something, just collecting information, need to make sure that there are no risks associated with collecting that information. And there are two sets of benefits. There are benefits to an individual. If you're doing a study with a drug that's treating a disease, the subjects may benefit because their disease may be better treated or cured by that potential therapy. Or there may be no benefits to the individual. You're looking at, let's say, drug addiction, and you're collecting information from drug addicts to determine why they how they got involved in being an addict, and you want to kind of use that information maybe someday to help prevent people from becoming addicts, but it's really not going to benefit that individual. So in that case, the benefits may be more to society rather than to the individual themselves. A minimization of risk. So it seems pretty easy, but need to kind of consider that a little bit more closely. So whenever we study anything, we want to have a control group that we're not subjecting to our treatment or drug or anything else. And controls we need to make sure that controls receive no less than the standard of care. So let's say you're testing a cancer drug. You need to make sure that your control subjects are receiving what's considered the standard of care to treat that cancer at that time. So if there's 10 different treatments, then they need to be treated with one of those 10 different treatments, whichever one works best for them at the time. And you would be comparing your drug to those current treatments. You can't leave them untreated and just to test and see if your drug is effective. They need to be treated to the best of the ability in that time. So another way to minimize risk is to, again, do as much testing in animals and demonstrate efficacy in animals before you ever touch a human subject. In some cases, that may be difficult. There may not be animal models for certain diseases, or the animal models may not be efficacious in comparison with humans. But nonetheless, you need to make sure you do as much applicable animal testing before you ever touch a subject. And IRBs will be looking for that. Consideration of individual subject sensitivities. Again, there are a lot of sensitive subjects that you might be testing: drug addiction, HIV status, things that might affect people's standing in society, or in some cases employment, insurance. So we need to make sure that those are taken into consideration and adequate protections are provided in order to minimize the risk of a study. Next slide. And justice. The final pillar is justice. Selection of subjects. I kind of talked about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Subjects should be the benefactors of the work. They should not bear the burden without the possibility of the benefits. So when they did the Tuskegee study, they basically went to rural African Americans because, they were dealing with people who were not intelligent people. They had a low level of education and basically trusted the scientists that they were doing the best for them when in fact they weren't doing that. So I also want to use the cases, let's say you develop the next best plastic surgery treatment. You can do this, but there's a lot of risk associated with it. And it's also an expensive treatment. It may cost $100,000. So you go into a rich neighborhood because they're the only ones who can afford this treatment, and you go and try and enlist subjects. You're offering, let's say, $5,000, to be in your study, and they all turn you down, because, they're not taking those risks. So now you decide to go in a homeless shelter and offer it for that same $5,000. You may get a lot of takers on it, and, they're going to, basically have the burden of those risks without ever being able to afford that treatment. So they would be basically bearing the burdens without having any possibility of the benefits. So we would take that into consideration when we're recruiting subjects. So, all right, next slide. I'll kind of switch gears here and talk about a little bit of IRB review of human subject studies. So next slide. All right, so I always get this question, does my study need to be submitted to the IRB? And my answer is almost always going to be yes. If you have questions as to whether it's a human subject study, then I have questions whether it's a human subject study. Most people are not going to be able to give me all of the information. If I've ever looked at our study protocol form, it's about 27 pages. Actually, we reduced the size of it lately, but nonetheless, we need a lot of information to make that determination whether it is or is not human subjects research, and IRB only has the expertise to do that. Although I oversee the IRB, I'm not a member of the IRB because that would be considered coercive on my part, leading the IRB and having a say in their discussions. They stand independent from me and independent from the university. But nonetheless, you need to submit studies to the IRB and let them make that determination. There are certain studies where they may look like human research, but they may not be. If you're working in a physician's office and there are several standard of care procedures, you may want to determine which one works best in your office, and different ones may work better in different offices. You just want to know you have two procedures, and I want to just do a quality improvement because I want to know which one works best in our office. In that case, we would not consider that human subjects research unless you decided to publish that or present that data, in which case we might consider that human subjects research. Most other types of research are going to be considered research. They may be considered minimal risk research, very few risks, but nonetheless, they will be considered human subjects research. And sorry about that. And only the IRB can make that call. If you have questions on your research and you decide, well, you know what, I think it's not research. However, you know what, I'm going to publish it. A lot of journals will ask, was this, considered human subjects research or not? You may be pretty sure it wasn't. And they'll say, well, you know what, go submit it to the IRB and, let them tell us that it's not human subjects research. So we can do that. You can submit the study after you did it. And, the IRB can say that was not human subjects research. However, there are cases where all of a sudden we'll look at what you thought was not human subjects research and realize, ooh, there's this one caveat in it that makes it human subjects research. Let's say you did a quality improvement study and you were looking at children. Children are protected population, and you didn't take that into consideration. Ooh, you just did research without approval. That's serious noncompliance. Now we need to report you to the government that you did research without approval. So don't take that chance. In most cases, if you're doing a simple study, it's a very quick application, and we'll get you the result back quick and let you know whether it is not human subjects research. And then you can provide that when you're giving presentations or publications, and you're all taken care of. So always submit to the IRB if you have a question that it's human subjects research. All right, next slide. All right. So, when you submit to the IRB, we have lots and lots of questions and need lots and lots of information. The reason why we need it is not out of curiosity. We don't strive to make your life miserable and make you do extra work. It's because we have a lot of different rules and regulations throughout, government, and that we need to make sure that we adhere to and you adhere to, and it's for your own protection. We need to deal with Health and Human Services Common Rule. We need to deal with the FDA. Our state has some additional rules that apply. We sometimes need to consider HIPAA. Sometimes local laws. We're also an accredited university, so our accreditors, AHRP, hold us to a bit of a higher standard than unaccredited institutions. That allows us to do a lot of commercial studies, so we don't take that lightly. So we need to make sure that we adhere to our accreditation. We have an FWA where we basically promise the government that we're going to do all of our research according to human subjects rules and regulations. Sometimes different institutions, our university may have different requirements, and also sometimes drug sponsors or sponsors may have their own requirements. So there's a lot involved when we do an IRB review. It's not as simple as just stating that, yes, it sounds like it's a good study and we can move forward. We have checklists and worksheets, and basically all of those checklists and worksheets are based on the rules. They're basically, we look at the rules. And is this taken care of? And we need to basically check all of those boxes before we can approve your research. And that's the reason why we ask so many questions and may have follow-ups for you. So next slide. So different types of IRB determinations, kind of talked about those. Not human subjects research. Like I said, if you're doing quality assurance or quality improvement programs, we may give you a determination. We looked at your study and we don't consider it human subjects research, and you're good to go without doing anything further. There's also a class of exempt studies. These are considered minimal risk categories of research. There's 8 categories of minimal risk. And we may say, yes, this is human subjects research, but the risks are so low that we consider it exempt from the regulations. You don't need to consider the regulations. You don't need to you're good to basically go the way you wrote it down. Now, do need to be a little bit cautious. You cannot make changes to, if we give you an exempt determination and you make changes to your study, you may need to resubmit that study back to the IRB, because sometimes people will make changes that will change that determination. So just because we say it's exempt from the regulations, you're free to go ahead and do your study without any further regulation, does not mean you can make changes to that study without it being reviewed again. So just be cautious of that. The next class would be expedited reviews. Those are considered minimal risk studies where there are some risks, but they're considered minimal. I'll talk a little bit about minimal risk in the future because that's an important caveat to consider. The last level, which is the highest level of regulation, is the full committee review. Those are basically where there are significant risk in a study. Those are basically the drug and device type studies where there's significant risk to health and safety. So, all right, next slide. So minimal risk. Minimal risk has a very defined definition in our world, in the IRB world. Minimal risk is defined as harm or discomfort anticipated in the research is not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life. And yes, that can be gray. People in the IRB may have a different definition of what is ordinarily encountered in daily life compared to what our investigators may or may not have. However, the IRB, they may reconsider if you have proper justification. But in general, if you're arguing, their definition of minimal risk, they've reviewed thousands and thousands of studies, and we're pretty much going to take their determination when it's considered minimal risk or when it's not considered minimal risk. So don't try and fight that determination if they consider it more than minimal risk. Minimal risk also doesn't just take into consideration risk, physical risk. It also takes into consideration risk of privacy and confidentiality. So certain studies, you're just doing a survey study, you're asking people questions on, let's say, drug addiction, and you consider, they're only taking a survey. There's really no risk to taking a survey. You're just rating information. However, those may be considered more than minimal risk. Let's say you're a drug addict, you're using illegal drugs. Well, there's a risk if your data got out and the police got your data that you're an illegal drug user, you could get arrested. That's considered a more than minimal risk. So even though you're just doing a survey, that may be bumped up into a full committee, more than minimal risk review just because of the subject of your research. So that's kind of how the IRB looks at minimal risk. Next thing is recruitment. We look closely at how you're recruiting patients. I talked a little bit about this with the pillars of the Belmont report. You need to provide adequate information on a recruitment poster. A recruitment poster is different than a consent. When you're doing recruitment, you're basically hanging up posters, or you're just basically telling people that you have a research study that they may want to take a closer look at. So when you're doing recruiting, it's much shorter than consent, but you still need to provide adequate information. You need to specify that the study is research. We get a lot of pushback from this. If I put that on a poster or if I announce that, nobody's going to sign up for this study. Well, that is actually the law in the regulations. If you are doing a research study, it has to state that in the recruitment. There's no ands, ifs, or buts about it. You can't state that there are benefits, that this is a treatment. It needs to be specified that this is research. That is a non-starter. You need to have that. You need to have contact information for questions. Seems pretty basic, but sometimes the phone number you might provide is just, hey, I want to be in the study, but it's not an expert on the study. They're just taking names. You do need to have contact information if somebody has questions on the study. You need to make sure that your recruitment is not coercive. We see this all the time, large print, $50 for this study. And in the tiny print at the bottom, there are significant risks to this study, blah, blah, blah. We never allow that. In fact, a lot of times we won't even allow you to print what the compensation for the study is. You can just put financial compensation available, and the risks have to be put in the recruitment poster in the same print that you put in compensation is provided. Target population, again, who are you targeting? Are you just putting these signs in homeless shelters, or are you putting them, in the university, or, where you're putting where you're doing your recruitment? That's going to be something we take into account. HIPAA issues. There may be HIPAA issues also. A lot of times studies, physicians will say, I want to look into people in my practice or in my hospital, and I want to target people who have a certain disease or condition. And you're allowed to go into the public health records. However, you need to apply and get a get permission from the IRB to do that before you do that. You can't just go start surfing people's public health information and decide who you want to do that. You may need to get a HIPAA waiver to do that. You need to have the IRB approve your HIPAA waiver before you ever start looking into the PHI. You can't just go browsing people's health records to determine who you want in your study. Next slide. Consent process. I talked a lot about this, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. Talked about layman's terms. Need to describe all the procedures, and I kind of alluded to this. It's not only procedures that are take place on the subject, it's also those that you do in the back. If you're collecting data from these people, what are you going to do with that data? Who are you going to provide it to? Who's going to be analyzing the data? You need to describe that. Describe the risk. Obviously, we talked a lot about that. You need to describe all of the risk. Can't overstate the benefits of your research. If you have a cancer drug, you can't state that, we're testing a cure for cancer. No, you're testing a new treatment for cancer. Also can't put compensation. If you're paying people for being in their study, that is not considered a benefit. The compensation that you provide to people should only compensate them for should be equal to the burden of their participation in the study. So you can't provide huge amounts of compensation. If you're keeping people for 4 hours of the day, compensation should be, their cost of time for that 4 hours. You can't offer a huge amount of compensation just because you want to get people in your study. Again, we talked about describing alternative treatments. Need to describe if you're keeping data past the study. A lot of us, when we collect our data or collect specimens from a study, we may want to save those for doing future research studies. We can always use data as the basis for future research, and that's allowed. Same thing with specimens. It's allowed to keep that data for future research. However, you may need to reconsent those people on that future research. If there are significant risks, then you may need to let those people know, hey, I'm going to save your data or your specimens for future research. But if we do that future research, we're going to send you a consent form to use those specimens in that future research. Also, the IRB is going to look at your consent process, where you're going to be doing the consent, may have privacy issues. Excuse me. Who's going to be doing the consent? Need to make sure that you have an expert that can answer all the questions, or have an expert available that can answer questions that the person doing the consent process cannot. And also how long you're going to give subjects to decide whether they want to be in the study. If it's an emergency room procedure where you have people rolling in the emergency room who are critical, they may only have minutes to make a decision whether they want to be in a study to test something that you're doing. On the other hand, if let's say a cancer treatment, well, maybe they'll have a couple of days or a couple of weeks to make that decision. So you send them home with a consent form, have them consider it, give them the chance to answer, to ask questions, and give them adequate time to decide to be in the study. All right, next slide. Also, vulnerable populations. We talked about several vulnerable populations. Primarily, it's children, prisoners, or people who have limited cognitive ability who we're going to give extra protection. We may have a legally authorized representative be the person who gives the consent for that person to be in the study. That's the case with children, prisoners, and also people of limited cognitive ability. We also, if it's possible, we'll have those people assent. So obviously babies can't assent, so we're not going to have babies allowed to assent. But children, on the age of 7 to 14 or 14 to 18 may be able to, sort of understand the study and may be able to decide, whether they want to be in the study. They can't give their own consent, but they can give their assent. And even if a parent consents to have a child in a study, but when you explain the study on an assent to that child, the child says, no, I don't want to be in that study. The child cannot be enrolled in the study if they fail to assent properly. And we have documents on providing assent that that describe it in a child's ability to understand. So we do have assent documents that you can provide children. But nonetheless, assent has to be given. Same thing goes with people of limited cognitive ability. You need to describe the study, and if they say they don't want to be in the study, even if their legally authorized representative says they want them to be in the study, can't enroll them. Injury compensation. Also, like I said, I talked a bit about this before. If there's a chance of injury, you need to tell people, if they're going to be compensated for injury. In some cases, you may not have the money to compensate them, and that's fine. You can go ahead with the study and say, you know what, there's a chance you're going to be injured in this, and I have no money to cover that injury. Again, as long as that's given to people and they decide, well, I'm willing to take that risk, and that's fine to go ahead with it. On the other hand, a lot of times, drug companies may have some funds to cover injury compensation, but again, that needs to be covered in your consent. And again, I talked about cost of subject, so I won't go through that again. Next slide. Okay, so when you're filling out that long protocol, give as much detail as possible. It's going to make your review go a lot quicker. Don't try and hide things. The IRB is pretty good at determining when people are trying to hide things, and they will ask more questions. And if they have to go back and forth with you, it's going to take a lot longer to get your protocol approved. So provide as much detail as possible. Adequately describe the risk. There are always risks with any study you do. It may be walking across the busy street, but there are always risks with any study. Even if it's considered a minimal risk study, there may be risk, that may, compared to daily risk, but there are risks with the study. So make sure you adequately describe all of the risks, no matter how minor they are. Again, talked about protecting vulnerable subjects, so I won't go through that again. When you're answering questions, it may sound like a question is not applicable, but truly ask yourself if it's not applicable. If you don't fill it out and the IRB feels it is applicable, then they're going to have you fill it out anyway. So if it is applicable, fill it out. If you're not consenting people, you may need to justify why you have a waiver of consent. Well, this is a simple study. I'm collecting information. I'm sitting in a park and just watching people walk by and how they walk by. I don't want to have to consent people. Well, that's perfectly fine. You can justify it. There's no risk. I'm just walking, watching the gait of people or something like that. I don't want to have to stop thousands of people and get consent. So, if you're not getting consent for studies, then that's perfectly fine as long as you have justification. Non-English speakers. We like to see non-English speakers be included in studies. The IRB lots of times questions people, why aren't you including Spanish speakers? You may not have a consent form that's in Spanish. And there are ways of getting enrolling those, but again, those are going to be questions. If you're not including non-English speakers, you need to provide a reason why and a justification as to why, because you might be preventing them from getting the benefits of doing the research, and need to have a good reason if you're not including non-English speakers. Sometimes there's no benefits to these subjects, and that's the justification, and we're fine with that. One of the reasons that we usually don't accept is I don't have money to get my consent form translated. Money is not a reason. Financial reasons are not a reason why not to include non-English speakers. Again, talked about the HIPAA waiver, so I won't go through that. Next slide. Okay, so non-compliance. We have cases of serious non-compliance, a couple of cases a year usually, and that is reportable to the federal government Office of Human Research Protections if you are found guilty of serious non-compliance. So what are the most common reasons why I see serious non-compliance? It's usually nothing major. It's usually kind of minor things, but they are considered. Performing study with unapproved methods. This is a common case of serious noncompliance. So you're doing a study and all of a sudden you realize, oh, you know what? I should have put this in I should have done it a different way. It's not really a serious change in my methods, but I'm going to do it. I'll apply to the IRB and I'm sure they're going to approve it. But I've got 10 subjects coming in today and it's going to take the IRB probably a few days to approve it. I'm just going to go ahead with the new method. That is considered serious noncompliance. You just performed a study with unapproved methods, no matter how minor those changes were. That's considered serious noncompliance, and we get cases of that and have to report you to the federal government. Performing research without approval seems pretty easy. But that part in parentheses or prior to is usually where people get into trouble. Oh, I submitted my study to the IRB. I've submitted 10 other studies. They've always gotten approved. I'm using the same methods and or similar methods, and I know it's going to get approved. However, I can start, this study early. I know it's going to be approved in the next week or so. Well, if you start that study before you get that letter from the IRB, that is research without approval, and that is serious noncompliance. Protocol deviation. Sometimes simple things. You say I'm going to provide a drug to people, and I'm going to have them come in within the next 2 weeks to do some testing and see how they're doing. Well, somebody goes on vacation for 2 weeks. It's going to be 15 days. I can get them in. 1 day really isn't going to make a difference. I haven't seen any serious changes. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Well, again, that is a protocol deviation. You did research, not according to your, what you, sent to the IRB, and that is considered serious noncompliance. Again, enrolling ineligible subjects seems pretty common. You may have some criteria for enrolling subjects, and they need to fit it. Certain, let's say, a drug test, and one of their factors is, one of their levels, let's say, of bilirubin is out by just a tad. You have 20 other tests. They fit every criteria, pass every test. They're just a tad off on that one bilirubin. And you know what? That really isn't going to have much of an effect on your study. I'm going to enroll them anyway because it's so minor. But you cannot do that. Now you can go back and you can change this, say you have this a lot, you can go back and submit a modification to your study. You know what? 14 days I thought was going to work, but you know what? 21 days is easier to do getting subjects in. Or you know what? The bilirubin can be a little bit higher than normal levels because it's not going to make a difference. As long as you submit that to the IRB and get that approved, you're fine to do that. But again, if you do that without having that approved prior to doing it, you're subject to serious noncompliance. Unapproved personnel working on the study. We see this all the time too. I'm adding another doctor. He's perfectly qualified. I'm going to submit a modification. I know it's going to take a couple of days, but you know what? He's here now today. He's just going to be assisting me on the study. But if he's not approved by the IRB, even if he's the most qualified person in the world, that is serious noncompliance. Then improper consent process. You didn't have somebody who was approved to do the consent process, or you didn't have an expert to answer questions and other reasons. So those are kind of the common cases of serious noncompliance that we see. Again, a lot of minor things, but again, those are considered serious noncompliance. All right, next slide.
We have about 15 minutes remaining.
Okay, I'm just going to go through some cases now. So here's kind of a case, and I'm just going to kind of put this forward. This was an actual submission we got to the IRB. An investigator proposed, and think about your Belmont report and what we talked about. An investigator proposed a study to determine if a new pain control regimen was effective. And a study design was basically to compare two groups of individuals who had undergone a painful surgical procedure. This was actually a dental procedure, so it wasn't a super invasive surgical procedure, but nonetheless, it was an invasive surgical procedure. And the test subjects would receive a new pain medication, and the control group was proposed to receive no pain medication. So obviously, if you're doing a dental procedure and somebody's going to have pain, you may send them home, and it may be something as simple as take, ibuprofen, 2 tablets every 6 hours or whatever, to manage your pain. But if you're telling your control subjects to take no pain medication, then, obviously that is not going to be approvable. And this study was actually disapproved for that reason. So I won't go through, it's easier to do this in person, but since I don't have people in front of me, I won't ask the questions of the group. Next one, some more case presentation. So this was a project that was a malaria project, and we'll go through this one, thinking about the Belmont principles. So the goal was to develop and test an effective treatment prophylactic for malaria. In the background, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I'm going to feed you facts a little bit at a time. So think about this and think about, if this is approvable with what we talked about. So the background is there's no effective treatment for malaria. And only human tests were planned to do this study. They didn't plan on doing any animal testing. They wanted to go straight to humans. The subject pool that they picked to test these prophylactic treatments were going to be tertiary syphilis patients who had cognitive defects. They had They basically had cognitive effects where they weren't able to understand the consent process. So they're a protected group of people. They also wanted to pick mentally ill patients and prisoners to do their testing on. So again, does this sound like we would approve this as the as a test pool? The answer is no, we're not going to allow that. So now I'll provide a little bit more background on it. So this was a project that was taken on at the beginning of World War II. And malaria was endemic in a lot of the areas where U.S. troops were going to be deployed. And it takes about 2 soldiers to manage any single soldier that contracts malaria. So it's a huge drain on logistics, and malaria caused more casualties than battle in areas that were endemic with malaria. So there was a huge strain on logistics. Again, there's no effective treatment for malaria. And I'll also add, there's no good animal model for malaria. And that is the reason why they may be allowed to go directly into humans, because there's no applicable animal model to do testing with malaria. Now they could do the testing on the different drugs and treatments they were going to try, the different chemicals. They could test them in animals to see if they're safe for safety, but they couldn't test them for effectiveness in animals. So yeah, we may allow that. Subjects to be infected. Again, you're looking at that pool. That seems to be a bad pool. It looks like they're just kind of picking people who are convenient, who can't get proper consent. So let's move to the next slide. So the rationale was that winning or losing the war would justify the risk for doing this study. There would be huge benefits to mankind, regardless of whether we won or lost the war, because if you developed a prophylactic agent or treatment agent for malaria, people would benefit regardless of who won the war. Here's some more information. High fever tended to cure syphilitics, and malaria caused high fever. It also improved if syphilitics got high fevers and were cured of syphilitics, their neurological issues tended to improve. So that was the reason why they wanted to look at syphilitics. Again, remember, we're talking World War II. There was no treatment for syphilis. If you got tertiary syphilis, you were going to die from it. So this potential treatment, when they were challenging them with malaria and giving them high fevers, would actually possibly cure some of those tertiary syphilitic patients. So that was a justification for using tertiary syphilitic patients with neurological issues. Then they took it one step further. They said if high fever could, treat neurological issues in syphilitics, well, maybe it could also treat some people with mental issues as well. And that was the reason why they included the mentally ill. So, that was their justification, that subjects might actually incur some benefits to the treatment by being exposed to malaria. And prisoners wanted to serve their country at the time. This was World War II. Prisoners were still patriotic, so they were given commuted sentences at the time if they would take place in research studies like this. And at the time, that was allowed. Today, it's not allowed, but back then it was. And in general, it was considered that, all of these subjects, mentally ill, prisoners, or syphilitics, were kind of a drain on society, so that these subjects owed society. Again, like I said, different times, things that were considered acceptable back then are not considered acceptable today. But again, that was the reason for the study. Let's go on. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this case. This was actually a case that took place in Buffalo, potential case. UB Art students started posting this back in 2017, whites only and blacks only signs all over the university. And when they were questioned about it by UB police, they said it was a research study. And I got a call from the VPR's office stating, "Do we, approve this study?" And luckily, we did not approve any such study. And the art student actually clarified that it was not a social research project. I'm not going to go through it because I was going to use the Belmont principles to go through it. We can go through the slides quickly. Whether it went through the Belmont principles, you can go through the slides. You're going to have it and look at it. But I won't go through it at this point. So I think that's my last case study. Again, here's a table of modern day experiments. So did the Belmont report and all the rules and regulations we have solve our problem? No, we are still seeing issues with people carrying out unethical studies. This is a list of them that takes place. I haven't updated it in a while, and I'm sure there are more updated studies that are taking place. So even though we have all the regulations in place, we still have investigators who are testing the bounds and going past the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. So again, I hope this talk helped you to prevent you from going down that road. And I'll end my presentation there.